One glance in the mirror exposed a truth someone killed to hide. Welcome to Sherlock Hub. I am your host, Bracknell. Comment where you're watching from. Your voices matter here. Grateful to read them all. Now, the mystery begins. The autumn of 1894 brought with it a peculiar melancholy to London, as though the city itself had grown weary of its own secrets. A persistent fog clung to the cobblestones of Baker Street, muffling the clatter of hansoms and rendering the gas lamps into pale, ghostly orbs that floated in the murk. It was on such an evening, whilst I sat by the fire in our familiar lodgings, that I observed my companion Sherlock Holmes in one of his more restless moods. He had spent the better part of the afternoon hunched over his chemistry bench, conducting experiments of such obscure purpose that even I, and his chronicler and confidant, dared not inquire as to their nature. The acrid smell of sulfur and ammonia had driven me to open the window a crack, despite the chill, and now Holmes paced before the hearth like a caged panther, his long fingers steepled beneath his aquiline nose. "Watson," said he abruptly, breaking a silence that had persisted for nearly 20 minutes, "do you believe that mirrors possess memory?" I lowered my copy of the Lancet and regarded him with the mixture of bewilderment and affection that his pronouncements so often inspired. "Memory, Holmes? They are but glass and silver. They reflect what stands before them, nothing more." "Precisely." He wheeled about with that sudden energy that marked the beginning of his intellectual pursuits. "They reflect what stands before them at the present moment. Yet consider this. Might not the very act of reflection leave some imperceptible trace? Some molecular rearrangement in the silvering, invisible to the naked eye, yet detectable through sufficiently refined methods? "I confess the notion strikes me as rather fanciful," I replied, though I had learned long ago that Holmes's fancies often proved to be founded upon the most rigid scientific principles. "Fanciful indeed, and quite impossible with current technology," he conceded, throwing himself into his chair with theatrical despair. "Yet it illustrates a principle, Watson. We assume that the past leaves no trace save in memory and documentation, but what if every surface, every object that witnessed a crime retained some echo of that moment? What mysteries might we solve?" He fell silent then, he staring into the flames with that peculiar intensity that suggested his mind had already departed to some distant realm of deduction. I was about to return to my medical journal when the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs arrested my attention. Mrs. Hudson's voice, raised in protest, was followed by a sharp knock upon our door. "Come!" Holmes called out, sitting upright with renewed animation. He had heard something in those approaching footsteps, their urgency, their weight, some quality imperceptible to my own ears, that had already informed him this was no ordinary visitor. The door burst open to reveal Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his ferret-like features flushed from exertion and his breath coming in short gasps. He held his bowler hat crushed against his chest, and his eyes, usually so sharp with official confidence, now darted about with unconcealed agitation. "Mr. Holmes! Dr. Watson!" he exclaimed. "Thank God you're both here. I've come straight from Belgravia, and I tell you I've never seen the like of it in all my years on the force." Holmes rose with fluid grace, his entire demeanor transformed. The languor of moments before had vanished, replaced by the alert intensity of a hunting hawk. "Pray compose yourself, Lestrade. Mrs. Hudson, some brandy for our guest if you would be so kind." "Now then, Inspector, begin at the beginning. You have come from Belgravia, you say? From the residence of someone of considerable wealth, I presume, given the mud on your boots. That particular yellow clay is found only in the better squares where the roads are properly maintained." Lestrade glanced down at his boots in surprise, and then accepted the brandy that our landlady had materialized with. He took a bracing sip before speaking. "It's Lord Blackwood's residence at number 12 Chesham Place. he began, his voice steadying. Lord Edmund Blackwood, the industrialist, made his fortune in South African diamonds and railway speculation. He's been found dead in his study, murdered, Mr. Holmes, and in the most peculiar circumstances imaginable. Murdered, Holmes repeated, his eyes glittering with interest. You are certain it is murder and not some tragic accident or medical event? Certain as I've ever been of anything, Lestrade replied grimly. The man was stabbed through the heart with a letter opener, his own letter opener, whilst seated at his desk. But here's the devil of it. The room was locked from the inside. The key was in the lock, and the windows are 30 feet above a paved courtyard with no possible means of access, and there's not a soul who could have done it. It's impossible, Mr. Holmes, absolutely impossible. Excellent, Holmes exclaimed, rubbing his hands together with evident satisfaction. This display of enthusiasm at the news of murder was, I must confess, one of his less endearing qualities, though I understood it stemmed not from callousness, but from intellectual excitement. The impossible is invariably the most interesting, Lestrade. When did this occur? The body was discovered at 6:30 this evening by Lord Blackwood's valet, a man named Hendricks. His lordship had given orders not to be disturbed after 4 o'clock, as he was attending to important correspondence. When he failed to appear for dinner at 7, Hendricks became concerned and knocked repeatedly. Receiving no answer and hearing no sound from within, he fetched Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, and together they convinced Lady Blackwood that the door should be forced. And it required forcing. The household carpenter had to remove the hinges. When they entered, they found Lord Blackwood slumped over his desk, quite dead, with the ivory-handled letter opener buried to its hilt just below his ribs. The room was in perfect order, save for a looking-glass, a large, ornate mirror that hangs opposite his desk, which had been turned to face the wall. At this detail, Holmes's expression sharpened with interest. The mirror had been turned? You are certain it had been deliberately repositioned? Quite certain. There are screw holes in the wall showing its former position, and it would require considerable effort to rotate such a heavy piece. Lady Blackwood confirmed that it had always hung facing into the room, as it was an antique Venetian glass of which her husband was particularly proud. Fascinating, Holmes murmured. And you found no trace of any intruder? No disturbed papers? No sign of struggle? None whatsoever. The papers on his desk appeared to be business correspondence, perfectly ordinary. There's a safe in the wall, unopened and undisturbed. Nothing appears to have been taken. It's as though Lord Blackwood admitted death himself into that room, locked the door behind him, and submitted to murder without the slightest resistance. Holmes stood silent for a moment, his fingers drumming against his chin. Who inherits Lord Blackwood's estate? His wife, Lady Catherine Blackwood. I inherits the bulk of it, though there are provisions for his younger brother, Mr. Reginald Blackwood, and his business partner, a Mr. Theodore Ashworth. The will is quite complicated, I'm told, with various trusts and arrangements. Lord Blackwood's solicitor has been summoned and should arrive tomorrow morning. And where is the household now? I've left Constable Murray on duty and instructed that no one is to enter the study until you've had a chance to examine it. The family and servants are confined to the drawing room and their quarters. Lady Blackwood is, as you might imagine, in a state of considerable distress. She's asked specifically for you, Mr. Holmes. She remembered your work on the Trelawney inheritance matter some years ago. Holmes reached for his overcoat and gestured to me. Watson, your service revolver. If you please. We depart immediately. Lestrade, you have done well to preserve the scene. This promises to be a most instructive case. As I retrieved my revolver from its drawer and shrugged into my own coat, I could not help but notice the gleam of satisfaction in Holmes's eyes. Here was the antidote to his restlessness, the challenge that would engage that remarkable mind at its fullest capacity. And as we descended the 17 steps to the street where Lestrade's police carriage waited, I felt the familiar thrill of the chase beginning once more. The fog had thickened during our conversation, and as we rattled through the gas-lit streets toward Belgravia, I found myself contemplating Holmes's earlier musings about mirrors and memory. Could it be mere coincidence that a mirror had featured so prominently in this impossible crime? With Sherlock Holmes, I had learned, there were rarely coincidences. The great detective sat opposite me in the carriage, his hawk-like profile occasionally illuminated by the passing street lamps, his mind already racing ahead to the locked room that awaited us. And I, as ever, prepared myself to observe and record, knowing that what seemed impossible to Scotland Yard would soon yield to the inexorable logic of my extraordinary friend. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was afoot. The carriage wheels clattered over the wet cobblestones as we made our way through the labyrinthine streets of Belgravia. Holmes remained silent throughout the journey, his eyes half closed in that state of intense concentration I had come to recognize as the prelude to his most brilliant deductions. Lestrade sat opposite, I fidgeting with his notebook and occasionally glancing at my companion as though hoping some revelation might suddenly burst forth. But Holmes was not to be hurried in his mental preparations. When at last we drew up before number 12, Chesham Place, I was struck by the imposing grandeur of the residence. It was a 4-story edifice of white Portland stone, its facade adorned with Corinthian columns that spoke of both wealth and refined taste. Every window blazed with light, giving the mansion an almost theatrical quality against the fog-shrouded darkness. A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered, despite the late hour and the constable standing guard at the entrance, for news of violent death travels swiftly through even the most respectable neighborhoods. "Clear the way there," Lestrade barked. And the crowd parted reluctantly as we mounted the steps. The door was opened by a tall, angular man whose black attire and composed demeanor marked him as the valet, Hendricks. His face was pale but controlled, though I noticed his hands trembled slightly as he took our coats. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, his voice carrying the cultured tones of a superior servant. "Lady Blackwood is most anxious to speak with you. She is in the morning room with Mr. Reginald Blackwood and Mr. Ashworth, but Inspector Lestrade indicated you would wish to examine his lordship's study first." "Quite correct," Holmes replied, his sharp eyes already cataloging details of the entrance hall, the fresh flowers in the vase, the position of the walking sticks in the stand, the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in the air. "The study, if you please. And I must insist on absolute privacy during my examination. Watson will accompany me naturally." Hendricks inclined his head and led us through a magnificently appointed corridor. The walls were hung with oil paintings in gilded frames, and our footsteps were muffled by Turkish carpets of evident expense. We passed a closed door from which I could hear the low murmur of voices, the drawing room where the household waited, no doubt, before reaching a heavy oak door at the corridor's end. A uniformed constable stood beside it, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "No one's been in since I arrived, Mr. Holmes," the young man reported. "Just as Inspector Lestrade ordered." "Excellent." Holmes paused with his hand upon the door handle, turning to address us all. "Lestrade, Watson may enter with me. The rest of you will remain here. No one is to cross this threshold until I have completed my initial observations. Is that understood?" The inspector nodded, though I detected a flash of wounded pride in his expression. Holmes, however, was already turning the handle, his entire being focused upon what lay beyond. The door swung open with a faint creak, and we stepped into the chamber where Lord Edmund Blackwood had met his mysterious and violent end. The study was a spacious room, perhaps 20 feet square, paneled in dark mahogany that absorbed the light from the gas fixtures and created an atmosphere of somber dignity. But it was not the expensive furnishings or the walls of leather-bound books that immediately captured my attention. It was the figure still slumped across the massive desk that dominated the center of the room. and beyond it, the large ornate mirror turned deliberately to face the wall, its decorated back presenting a curious blank canvas where reflection should have been. Holmes closed the door behind us with deliberate care, his movements precise and economical. For a long moment he stood motionless, his keen eyes sweeping across the room in a comprehensive survey that missed nothing. I had witnessed this ritual countless times before, yet it never ceased to impress me how he could absorb an entire scene in those first critical seconds, cataloging details that would escape even the most observant of ordinary men. "Do not move from where you stand, Watson," he murmured, holding up one long finger. "The floor may yet tell us much." He dropped to his knees and produced his magnifying lens from an inner pocket, examining the carpet with minute attention. I watched as he traced an invisible path from the door to the desk, occasionally pausing to study a particular spot with intense concentration. The body of Lord Blackwood remained as it had been found, though rigor mortis had set in, lending the corpse a grotesque rigidity. The ivory handle of the letter opener protruded from between his shoulder blades at an angle that suggested a downward thrust of considerable force. "The carpet shows no signs of struggle," Holmes announced, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "No scuff marks, no displaced furniture, no indication that Lord Blackwood attempted to defend himself or flee from his attacker. Either the blow was struck with such speed that he had no opportunity to react, or he did not perceive himself to be in danger until the moment of the attack." He approached the desk now, circling it with the patience of a predator. The surface was indeed orderly, as Lestrade had reported. Several letters lay arranged in neat stacks, their edges precisely aligned. An ornate fountain pen rested in its stand, and a blotter showed the faint mirror impression of recent writing, though the words were too fragmentary to decipher at a glance. A crystal decanter of brandy sat on a silver tray, accompanied by a single glass that contained perhaps an inch of amber liquid. "He was drinking when death came," I observed, gesturing toward the glass. "Indeed. And note the position of the decanter, Watson. It sits to his right hand, convenient for pouring, yet the glass itself is positioned to the left of the blotter. Why would a right-handed man, and the pen stand indicates he was right-handed, place his drink on his left side, where it would require him to reach across his work?" I had no answer, but Holmes did not seem to expect one. He had already moved on, his attention now fixed upon the letter opener itself. He did not touch it, but leaned close, studying the weapon and the wound it had created with clinical detachment. A single thrust, delivered with precision and strength. The blade has penetrated between the 5th and 6th ribs, almost certainly piercing the heart. Death would have been nearly instantaneous, though not so rapid that he could not have cried out. Yet no one heard any sound of distress. Curious. He straightened and turned his attention to the room's other features. The windows, as Lestrade had stated, were some 30 feet above a paved courtyard. I crossed to examine them and found them securely fastened from within, the brass catches showing no signs of tampering. The walls were solid mahogany paneling, and a thorough inspection revealed no hidden doors or secret passages of the sort that feature so prominently in sensational literature, but so rarely in actual architecture. Finally, Holmes approached the mirror. It was a magnificent piece, perhaps 5 feet in height and 3 in width, framed in elaborately carved gilt that depicted cherubs and flowering vines in the Venetian style. The frame itself must have weighed a considerable amount, and I could see the strain it had placed upon the wall mounting. Holmes examined the screws that held it, then gently grasped the frame and attempted to rotate it. The mirror resisted at first. She then moved with a ponderous weight that required both of Holmes's hands to manipulate. He turned it carefully back to its original position, and I found myself staring at our reflections in the silvered glass. 2 figures rendered ghostly and distorted by the lamplight and the antique imperfections of the Venetian craftsmanship. Behind our reflected forms, I could see the desk and the terrible tableau of Lord Blackwood's final moments captured in reverse. "Observe the angle, Watson," Holmes said softly, his eyes fixed not upon our reflections but upon what lay behind them in the mirror's surface. "When properly positioned, this glass provides a perfect view of the entire room, including the door through which we entered. Anyone seated at that desk would have been able to see an intruder's approach reflected before them, even while appearing to be absorbed in their correspondence. The significance struck me immediately. Then Lord Blackwood would have seen his murderer enter the room." "Precisely. Unless, of course, the mirror had already been turned to face the wall before the murder took place. But that raises an even more intriguing question. Why would Lord Blackwood turn away such a useful security measure? Or if he did not turn it himself, who did? And when?" Holmes produced a small notebook from his pocket and made several quick sketches, his pencil moving with practiced efficiency. "The dust patterns on the wall behind the mirror show that it was rotated quite recently, within the last few hours, I should estimate. You can see the clean arc where the frame swept across the wallpaper, distinct from the older accumulation of dust beyond." He stepped back and surveyed the room once more, his brow furrowed in concentration. I could sense his mind working through the puzzle, examining each piece of evidence and testing it against various hypotheses. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the house and the muffled sounds of the city beyond the windows. "The locked door presents an obvious conundrum," I ventured, hoping to prompt some revelation. "If the room was secured from within, how did the murderer escape?" "The door is indeed locked and the key remains in place on the interior side," Holmes replied, crossing to examine the lock mechanism. He produced a slender metal instrument from his pocket and probed the keyhole with delicate precision. No scratches or marks to suggest the lock was picked from the outside. The tumblers show normal wear consistent with regular use. Nothing more. And yet, Watson, we must remember that what appears impossible often merely indicates that we are asking the wrong questions. He withdrew his instrument and turned the key, feeling the mechanism's action. A standard 3-lever mortise lock, nothing sophisticated. The key turned smoothly, no obstruction or damage. If someone locked this door from outside after committing the murder, they would need either a duplicate key or some method of manipulating the interior key through the keyhole, a technique that would almost certainly leave traces, which I do not observe. I moved to stand beside him, examining the door for myself, though I knew my observations would be crude compared to his trained perception. Could the murderer have remained hidden in the room? Perhaps concealed themselves and waited for an opportunity to escape after the body was discovered? An excellent suggestion, my dear fellow, and one I have already considered. Holmes gestured toward the room's sparse furnishings. But observe, there is the desk, too exposed to conceal anyone. The bookcases are built flush against the walls with no space behind them. No curtains grace these windows, and the space beneath the desk offers insufficient cover for even a child. Holmes crossed to a large wardrobe that stood against the far wall, the only piece of furniture we had not yet examined. He opened it with a quick motion, revealing nothing but a gentleman's smoking jacket and several reference volumes on mineralogy and industrial chemistry. The interior was shallow, offering no possibility of concealment, and Holmes closed it again with a slight shake of his head. "No, Watson. The murderer was not hiding in this room when the door was forced, which means they must have departed before Lord Blackwood's body was discovered, and yet the door was locked from within." He returned to the desk and carefully examined the letters that lay upon its surface, picking up each one with the tips of his fingers and scanning the contents. Business correspondence, as Lestrade indicated. A letter from his solicitor regarding some property transaction in Kensington. Another from the Diamond Syndicate concerning shipment schedules. Nothing that suggests immediate danger or conflict. I watched as he set down the letters and turned his attention to the blotter. He held it up to the light at various angles, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The impression here is from a letter written earlier today. I can make out fragments. Must insist. Final warning. And what appears to be conscience. Passionate language, Watson. This was no mere business communication. Could that letter still be in the room? An astute question. Holmes began a methodical search, examining each drawer of the desk in turn. They contained the usual accoutrements of a wealthy gentleman's private office: sealing wax, stamps, additional stationery, a box of expensive cigars, and various business documents organized with meticulous care. But nowhere did we find the letter whose impression remained on the blotter. Either it was posted before Lord Blackwood's death or the murderer took it, Holmes mused. In either case, its absence is suggestive. Someone received a strongly worded communication from our victim today, and by evening he was dead. The timing is hardly coincidental. He moved to the fireplace, which I had not previously examined with any care. The grate contained the ashes of a recent fire, and Holmes knelt before it, stirring the remains with a poker. Most had been consumed entirely, but among the gray powder, he discovered several fragments that had escaped complete destruction. Using his handkerchief, he carefully extracted these pieces and laid them upon the hearthstone. "Burned correspondence," he announced, studying the fragments with his lens. "Oh, someone, perhaps Lord Blackwood himself, destroyed papers in this fireplace not long before his death. The ashes are still faintly warm, Watson. Touch them carefully and you will feel it." I did as he suggested and found that he was correct. The ashes retained a ghost of heat that suggested they had been created within the last several hours. Holmes managed to preserve 3 small fragments that bore partial text, though the words were tantalizing in their incompleteness. One showed only the letters and proof of your, while another contained consequences will be s, and a third bore what appeared to be part of a signature, though only the final letters orth remained legible. "Ashworth," I said immediately. Could this be from Theodore Ashworth, Lord Blackwood's business partner? Possibly, though Worth is a common enough ending for English surnames. Farnsworth, Wordsworth, Kenilworth, the possibilities are numerous. Still, given that Mr. Ashworth is in this very house at this moment, it would be remiss not to consider the connection. Holmes folded the fragments carefully into an envelope and placed them in his pocket. These ashes tell us that Lord Blackwood felt compelled to destroy certain papers today. Papers that someone, quite possibly himself, judged too dangerous to preserve. He rose from the fireplace and dusted off his hands, his expression thoughtful. We must now consider the sequence of events as they appear to have unfolded. Lord Blackwood retires to his study at 4 o'clock, requesting not to be disturbed. At some point thereafter, he burns correspondence in the fireplace, and he writes a letter containing heated language about conscience and warnings. He pours himself brandy, though curiously places the glass in an awkward position. The mirror that would allow him to observe the door behind him is turned to face the wall. And finally, sometime before 6:30, he is stabbed through the heart with his own letter opener, yet makes no sound audible to the household. I nodded, following his reconstruction. Each element seems to contradict the others. If he felt threatened enough to destroy papers, why would he turn away the mirror that served as his eyes? If he expected danger, why did he not cry out when attacked? Indeed, Watson, the contradictions are instructive. Holmes moved to the window and gazed out into the fog-shrouded courtyard below. Oh, but let us not forget the most fundamental contradiction of all, the locked door. The murderer entered this room, committed their crime, and departed, all while leaving the door secured from within. Unless we are prepared to entertain supernatural explanations, which I am not, there must be a rational solution. He fell silent for a moment, his fingers drumming against the windowsill in that characteristic gesture that indicated deep thought. Then, quite suddenly, He spun around and strode to the desk once more. His eyes had taken on that peculiar intensity that I recognized as the sign of some important connection forming in his mind. "Watson, consider the brandy glass. You observed that it was positioned to the left of the blotter, inconvenient for a right-handed man. But what if Lord Blackwood did not place it there himself? Oh, what if someone else poured that drink and set it down? Someone who stood on the opposite side of the desk. You mean the murderer offered him brandy before stabbing him? Or during a conversation that preceded the violence? The glass is barely touched, perhaps an inch consumed. Either Lord Blackwood was not thirsty, or he was interrupted before he could drink more." Holmes picked up the glass carefully and held it to the light, examining its rim and interior surface. His expression grew sharp with interest. "There is a faint residue here, Watson, something beyond the normal sediment of aged brandy. I shall need to conduct a proper analysis, but my nose detects a bitter undertone that ought not to be present in spirits of this quality." The implication sent a chill through me. Poison? Possibly. Or merely some adulterant meant to accomplish a purpose short of death. In either case, the presence of foreign matter in this glass suggests premeditation. Someone came to this room prepared to do more than simply converse with Lord Blackwood. He wrapped the glass in his handkerchief and placed it carefully in his coat pocket, beside the envelope containing the burned fragments. A knock at the door interrupted our investigation. Holmes called out permission to enter, and Lestrade's head appeared in the doorway, his expression anxious. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but Lady Blackwood is becoming quite insistent about speaking with you. She says there are matters of urgency that cannot wait, and Mr. Reginald Blackwood supports her request. I've held them off as long as I could. Oh, but I fear they'll not be patient much longer." Holmes glanced around the study once more, as if committing every detail to memory. "Very well. I have seen enough for the moment, though I shall need to return for a more thorough examination in proper daylight. The body may be removed now, Lestrade, but I want this room sealed afterward. No one enters without my express permission." "Understood, Mr. Holmes." "And Lestrade, who discovered the body? You mentioned the valet and the housekeeper forced the door together." "That's right. Hendricks knocked first, received no answer, then fetched Mrs. Pemberton. They informed Lady Blackwood, who gave permission to break in. The carpenter removed the hinges and all three witnessed the scene together." "All three entered the room simultaneously?" "So they claim, sir." Holmes nodded slowly, filing this information away in that formidable mind. "Then let us meet with Lady Blackwood and hear what urgency compels her. Come, Watson. I suspect we are about to learn that this case is rather more complicated than a simple locked room murder." We followed Lestrade down the corridor toward the drawing room, passing beneath more of those expensive oil paintings that adorned the walls like silent witnesses to the household's prosperity. The murmur of voices grew louder as we approached, and I could distinguish at least 3 separate speakers engaged in what seemed to be a heated discussion. Lestrade paused before the door, straightened his coat, and knocked with official formality before entering. The drawing room was a study in opulent taste, its walls covered in silk damask the color of old wine, its furniture upholstered in complementary fabrics that spoke of both wealth and refinement. A chandelier of Waterford crystal cast prismatic light across the assembled company, who turned as one to regard us with expressions ranging from anxiety to barely concealed hostility. Lady Catherine Blackwood rose from her position on a settee with the practiced grace of her class. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair elaborately dressed, and eyes that showed the redness of recent tears, yet retained a keen intelligence. Her black mourning dress, which she must have donned with remarkable speed following her husband's death, suited her pale complexion and lent her an air of dignified suffering. "Mr. Holmes," she said, extending her hand. Thank God you have come. This nightmare grows more unbearable with each passing moment. Please, you must help us understand what has happened." Holmes took her hand briefly, his manner respectful but businesslike. "Lady Blackwood, you have my deepest condolences. I shall do everything in my power to discover the truth of your husband's death, but I must ask you some questions that may prove distressing." "I understand. Ask whatever you must." She gestured to the two men who had remained standing near the fireplace. "You should know that my brother-in-law, Mr. Reginald Blackwood, and my husband's business partner, Mr. Theodore Ashworth, are both here. They arrived within an hour of Edmund's death being discovered. I have no secrets from them, and they may hear whatever you wish to ask." I studied the two men with interest. Her Reginald Blackwood bore a strong family resemblance to his late brother, though his features were softer and his frame less robust. He was perhaps 5 years younger than the deceased, dressed in a dark suit that had the look of having been donned hurriedly, and his hands trembled slightly as they gripped a glass of whiskey. His eyes, when they met mine, showed genuine distress. Theodore Ashworth presented a striking contrast. He was a tall, powerfully built man of middle age with iron-gray hair and a military bearing that suggested either army service or simply a naturally authoritative disposition. His face was deeply tanned, as one might expect from someone involved in the South African diamond trade, and his expression was grave but controlled. Unlike Reginald, he showed no visible signs of emotional turmoil, though I noticed his jaw was set in a tight line that suggested suppressed feeling. Holmes acknowledged both men with a nod before returning his attention to Lady Blackwood. "I understand your husband requested privacy in his study from 4 o'clock this afternoon. Was this a common practice?" "Not particularly common, but not unprecedented either," she replied. "Edmund often conducted confidential business from his study. When he wished to work undisturbed, he would give instructions to Hendricks, and the household knew to respect his wishes." "Did he seem troubled or anxious when you last spoke with him?" Lady Blackwood hesitated, and I saw a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, or reluctance, cross her features. "We had luncheon together at 1 o'clock. Edmund seemed preoccupied. He barely touched his food. And when I inquired if something was wrong, he said only that certain business matters required his attention. He apologized for being poor company." "Did he mention expecting any visitors this afternoon?" "No, none. And Hendricks would have informed me if anyone had called. The household staff are quite particular about announcing visitors." Reginald Blackwood interjected suddenly, his voice hoarse. "My brother was being blackmailed, Mr. Holmes. He confided in me 3 weeks ago, though he swore me to secrecy. I have respected his wishes until now, but with his death I feel that silence serves no purpose." This revelation sent a ripple through the room. Lady Blackwood turned to her brother-in-law with an expression of shock, while Ashworth's eyes narrowed with what might have been surprise or suspicion. Holmes, however, showed no reaction beyond a slight inclination of his head. "Blackmailed," he repeated calmly. "On what matter?" Reginald set down his glass with a hand that shook noticeably. He did not provide details, and I did not press him. But he said that someone had discovered something from his past, something that could destroy his reputation and possibly expose him to legal consequences. He was paying them to keep silent, but he told me the demands had become increasingly unreasonable. "Did he indicate who was blackmailing him?" "No. He was adamant about protecting that information, even from me." Holmes turned to Ashworth, who had remained silent throughout this exchange. "Mr. Ashworth, as Lord Blackwood's business partner, were you aware of any financial irregularities or unusual withdrawals that might correspond to blackmail payments?" Ashworth's jaw tightened further, and for a moment I thought he might refuse to answer. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a man accustomed to command. "I was not aware of any blackmail, Mr. Holmes, but I cannot claim complete ignorance of financial irregularities. Over the past 2 months, Edmund withdrew approximately £8,000 from our partnership accounts in cash installments. When I questioned him about these transactions, he became evasive and irritable. He assured me the money was for a legitimate business opportunity that required discretion, but he refused to provide details. £8,000 is a considerable sum, Holmes observed. Did these withdrawals threaten the solvency of your business? No, our diamond interests are substantial, and we maintain healthy reserves. But the secrecy troubled me, Mr. Holmes. Edmund and I had been partners for 12 years. We built our enterprise on mutual trust and transparency. This departure from our established practices suggested something seriously amiss, and I told him so quite plainly. When did you last speak with Lord Blackwood? This morning at our offices in Hatton Garden. We had a rather heated discussion about the withdrawals. I informed him that I could not continue in partnership with a man who conducted secret transactions with our joint funds. I demanded a full accounting by tomorrow, or I would be forced to dissolve our partnership and pursue legal remedies. Lady Blackwood drew in a sharp breath. Theodore, you never mentioned this to me. You threatened my husband with legal action on the very day of his death? I did not threaten, Catherine. I merely stated the consequences of continued secrecy. Ashworth's tone softened slightly as he addressed her. I had no wish to harm Edmund. I hoped that my ultimatum would compel him to confide in me, to allow me to help him with whatever difficulty he faced. Had I known about the blackmail, I would have approached the matter entirely differently. Holmes had been listening with that peculiar stillness that indicated his mind was cataloging and cross-referencing every word. Mr. Ashworth, the fragments of a burned letter were found in Lord Blackwood's study. One piece contained letters that might spell your surname. Can you account for any correspondence you might have sent him today? Ashworth's eyes widened fractionally. I sent no letter today, Mr. Holmes. Our conversation took place in person at the office, as I said. If Edmund burned a letter bearing my name, it did not originate from me. Perhaps a letter about you, then, rather than from you, Holmes suggested. Can you think of any reason why someone might write to Lord Blackwood concerning you? None that would require burning, Ashworth replied stiffly, though I detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. My business dealings are a matter of public record, Mr. Holmes. I have nothing to hide. Holmes turned back to Reginald Blackwood. You said your brother confided in you 3 weeks ago about the blackmail. Have you spoken with him about the matter since then? Reginald nodded, but his face pale. I visited him here last week on Thursday evening. He seemed desperate, Mr. Holmes. He told me the blackmailer had increased their demands and was now insisting on something beyond mere money. He said he was being asked to do something that would compromise his honor and possibly endanger others. When I urged him to go to the police, he became agitated and made me promise again to keep silent. He said that exposure would be worse than whatever the blackmailer demanded. Did he give any hint as to the nature of what was being demanded? He mentioned documents. Access to certain documents related to our diamond acquisitions in South Africa. He seemed to fear that whoever was blackmailing him intended to use this information for purposes he could not condone. This detail caused Ashworth to straighten abruptly. Diamond acquisition documents? Reginald, are you certain? Those were his words. I assumed they related to business transactions you would know about. Ashworth's expression had grown dark. If someone sought access to those particular documents, Mr. Holmes, the implications are grave. Our operations in South Africa involved transactions with various parties, including some whose activities might not withstand rigorous scrutiny. Edmund and I maintained careful records to protect ourselves legally, but in the wrong hands, those records could be misconstrued or used to implicate us in activities we never condoned. Such as, Holmes prompted, labor practices, Mr. Holmes, the treatment of native workers in the diamond fields, political arrangements with local officials. The South African trade operates in a moral gray area. as any honest man in the business will admit. We always remained within the bounds of law, but the law itself is sometimes complicit in injustices. If someone wished to paint us as villains, our own documentation could provide the brush and colors. Lady Blackwood had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. Edmund never spoke of such things to me. He always said the business was entirely respectable. And so it was, Catherine, Ashworth assured her. But respectability and moral perfection are not always synonymous, particularly in colonial enterprises. Holmes absorbed this information with a thoughtful expression, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. These documents, where are they currently kept? In the safe in Edmund's study, Ashworth replied. We each maintained copies of critical papers. So Edmund insisted on keeping his set at home rather than at the office, claiming he felt more secure with them under his own roof. The safe in his study contains not only business documents, but also personal papers, and I believe a considerable amount of jewelry belonging to Lady Blackwood. Has the safe been opened since Lord Blackwood's death? No, Lady Blackwood answered. I possess no combination. Edmund always maintained that such matters were his responsibility alone. He said it was for my own protection, so that I could never be compelled to reveal its contents under duress. She paused, a bitter smile crossing her lips. I see now that his secretiveness extended far beyond mere husbandly protectiveness. Holmes rose and began to pace slowly before the fireplace, a habit that I knew presaged some important line of reasoning. Let me summarize what we have established thus far. Lord Blackwood was being blackmailed over some matter from his past. The blackmailer had recently escalated demands beyond money to include access to sensitive business documents. This morning, Mr. Ashworth confronted Lord Blackwood about unexplained financial withdrawals and threatened to dissolve their partnership. This afternoon, Lord Blackwood retired to his study with instructions not to be disturbed, burned correspondence, wrote a letter containing heated language about conscience and warnings, and was subsequently murdered in a locked room. Does this accord with everyone's understanding? The three occupants of the room nodded their agreement, though each wore an expression of troubled confusion. Then we must ask ourselves, Holmes continued, that whether the blackmail and the murder are connected, and if so, how? Was Lord Blackwood killed by his blackmailer to silence him? Or did he perhaps refuse the latest demand, prompting a violent response? Or are we dealing with an entirely separate motive? Perhaps someone who stood to benefit from his death in ways unrelated to blackmail. Reginald shifted uncomfortably. You are suggesting one of us might have killed my brother? I am suggesting nothing yet, Mr. Blackwood. I am merely outlining the logical possibilities. Holmes turned to Lady Blackwood with a penetrating gaze. Madam, I must ask you a delicate question. Your husband's will, are you familiar with its provisions? She met his eyes steadily, though I saw her hands clench in her lap. I inherit the house and an annual income of £5,000, and the remainder of Edmund's personal fortune, which I understand to be substantial, is divided between Reginald and a trust fund for our nephews and nieces. His share of the diamond business passes to Mr. Ashworth, with provisions for me to receive a percentage of future profits. So both Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Ashworth benefit financially from your husband's death. As do I, Mr. Holmes, she replied with surprising composure. I will not pretend that my marriage was a perfect union of hearts. Edmund and I maintained a cordial arrangement, but we had grown distant over the years. His business consumed him, and I found my satisfactions elsewhere, in charitable work, in society, in the company of friends. But I did not kill him, and I resent the implication. I imply nothing, Lady Blackwood. I merely establish facts. Holmes returned to his chair and fixed his attention on Ashworth once more. Mr. Ashworth, you mentioned that you and Lord Blackwood had a heated discussion this morning. Did anyone else witness this conversation? Our chief clerk, Morrison, was present for the beginning of it, but Edmund dismissed him so that we might speak privately. The argument that followed was between the two of us alone. And what time did this conversation conclude? Shortly before noon. I left the office immediately afterward and spent the afternoon at my club in St. James's. The porter there can confirm my presence from 12:30 until approximately 5 o'clock, when I received word of Edmund's death and came directly here. Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. Mr. Reginald Blackwood. Where were you this afternoon? Reginald's face flushed. I was at home in Kensington. Alone, I'm afraid. My housekeeper had the afternoon off, and I spent the time reading. I have no one who can vouch for my whereabouts, Mr. Holmes, but I swear to you I did not harm my brother. Whatever our differences over the years, he was still my flesh and blood. Differences? Holmes pounced on the word like a cat upon a mouse. What differences might those have been? Reginald glanced at Lady Blackwood apologetically before answering. Edmund was the successful one, Mr. Holmes. He inherited the bulk of our father's estate, built it into a fortune, married well, moved in the highest circles of society. I, meanwhile, have modest means and modest prospects. There was always a certain tension between us, unborn of comparison and perhaps resentment on my part. But resentment is not murder. Holmes regarded him with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor condemning, merely observant. Resentment has driven men to murder before, Mr. Blackwood, though I make no accusation at present. Tell me, did your brother ever discuss with you the specific nature of the secret that made him vulnerable to blackmail? Never. He was adamant about keeping that information to himself. I assumed it related to his business dealings, perhaps some transaction that violated regulations or ethical standards. Edmund could be ruthless when profit was at stake, though I believe he operated within legal boundaries, if not always moral ones. Before Holmes could respond, the drawing-room door opened and Hendricks appeared, his composure somewhat ruffled. Begging your pardon, Lady Blackwood, but there is a gentleman at the door who insists on speaking with Mr. Holmes immediately. He says the matter concerns Lord Blackwood's death and cannot wait. I told him the hour was inappropriate, but he was most insistent. Holmes rose with evident interest. Did this gentleman provide a name? He gave his card, sir. Hendricks produced a small rectangle of pasteboard and handed it to Holmes, who examined it with his lens before passing it to me. I read the name engraved in elegant script, Dr. Marcus Aldridge, Harley Street. A physician, I observed. Perhaps he attended Lord Blackwood? I was my husband's physician, Lady Blackwood interjected. Dr. Pembroke of Wimpole Street. I have never heard Edmund mention anyone named Aldridge. Holmes made a swift decision. Show, doctor. To Aldridge to the morning room, Hendricks, and inform him that I shall join him momentarily. Lady Blackwood, Mr. Ashworth, Mr. Blackwood, I must ask you all to remain here for the present. Lestrade, Watson, if you would accompany me. We followed Holmes from the drawing-room, leaving behind 3 individuals whose expressions ranged from bewilderment to apprehension. As we proceeded down the corridor, Holmes spoke in a low voice, intended only for our ears. A physician who arrives unbidden at the scene of a murder hours after it occurred, Watson. What does that suggest to you? Either he had some professional relationship with the deceased that we have not yet discovered, or he possesses information relevant to the crime. Precisely. And his insistence on immediate audience suggests urgency, perhaps fear that delay might render his information useless, or perhaps anxiety that his own position is compromised. Holmes paused before the morning room door. Let us see what Dr. Marcus Aldridge has to tell us. We entered to find a man of perhaps 50 years standing by the window, his back to us as he gazed out into the fog-shrouded street. He turned at our approach, and I saw a face marked by intelligence and considerable strain. His clothing was expensive but slightly disheveled, as though he had dressed in haste, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man wrestling with a difficult decision. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of the educated classes. "Thank God you agreed to see me. Now, I have been debating with myself for the past hour whether to come forward, and I confess the decision has cost me no small amount of anguish. I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. You have information concerning Lord Blackwood's death?" Aldridge nodded, his hands clasping and unclasping nervously. "I do, though providing it will violate the sacred trust between physician and patient. Yet I believe that under these extraordinary circumstances, my duty to justice must supersede professional confidentiality." "Lord Blackwood was your patient?" Holmes asked sharply. "Not in the conventional sense. He consulted me privately on a matter of extreme delicacy approximately 6 months ago. The consultation was conducted under conditions of absolute secrecy. He did not even provide his real name initially, though I recognized him from newspaper illustrations. He sought my professional opinion regarding a medical condition that he feared might destroy his reputation and marriage if it became known." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What was the nature of this condition?" Aldridge drew a deep breath before answering. "Lord Blackwood believed he had contracted a venereal disease, Mr. Holmes. He presented with symptoms that suggested syphilis in its early stages. He was frantic, insisting that he could not possibly consult his regular physician, as any record of such a diagnosis would inevitably lead to scandal and exposure. The implications hung heavy in the air, and Lady Blackwood's words about her distant marriage suddenly took on new significance, as did the blackmail that had haunted Lord Blackwood's final weeks. Holmes's expression remained neutral, but I could sense the rapid calculations occurring behind those keen eyes. "And what was your diagnosis, Dr. Aldridge?" "That is the extraordinary part, Mr. Holmes. Upon thorough examination and testing, I determined that Lord Blackwood did not have syphilis at all. His symptoms were psychosomatic, brought on by extreme anxiety and guilt." Holmes's eyes narrowed with intense focus. "Guilt, you say? Guilt over what? Precisely?" Dr. Aldridge hesitated, choosing his words with evident care. "Lord Blackwood confessed to me that he had engaged in a brief indiscretion with a woman who was not his wife. This liaison occurred during a business trip to Cape Town, approximately 8 months before he consulted me. He was convinced that this woman had infected him, and he was tormented by the fear that he might have subsequently transmitted the disease to Lady Blackwood." "But you determined he was not infected?" "Correct. I performed every available test, and all results were negative. I assured Lord Blackwood repeatedly that his symptoms were manifestations of psychological distress rather than physical disease. However, he remained unconvinced. He insisted on additional consultations over the following months, always maintaining absolute secrecy. The last time I saw him was 3 weeks ago, and he seemed even more agitated than before." Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing. 3 weeks ago, the same time he confided to his brother about the blackmail. Dr. Aldridge, did Lord Blackwood ever mention being threatened or extorted over this matter?" "Not explicitly, but during our final consultation he made a curious statement. He said that his moment of weakness in Cape Town had become a chain that bound him, and that someone was pulling that chain tighter with each passing day. When I asked what he meant, he refused to elaborate, saying only that medical confidentiality could not protect him from the consequences of moral failure. The pieces were assembling in my mind, though I could not yet see the complete picture." "Holmes, if someone knew about Lord Blackwood's fear of disease, whether founded or not, they could have used that knowledge to blackmail him." "Indeed, Watson. But who could have known?" "Doctor." "The Aldridge maintained confidentiality, and Lord Blackwood told no one else, or so it appears." Holmes turned back to the physician. "Did anyone else at your practice have access to Lord Blackwood's records?" "I keep no formal records of such sensitive consultations, Mr. Holmes. Everything was conducted with the utmost discretion. However," he paused, his face clouding with an expression of dawning realization, "there was one occasion when an appointment was interrupted. A colleague of mine, Dr. Whitmore, entered my consulting room unexpectedly while Lord Blackwood was present. I introduced them only by first names, and the encounter lasted mere seconds. But Dr. Whitmore is an observant man. He might have recognized Lord Blackwood." "And where is Dr. Whitmore now?" "That is what brings me here tonight, Mr. Holmes. Doctor, Whitmore left my practice rather abruptly 2 months ago. He claimed to have received an inheritance that would allow him to retire early, but his departure was sudden and his manner evasive. When I read in the evening papers about Lord Blackwood's death, a terrible suspicion entered my mind, one I could not ignore, despite the damage it might do to my professional reputation." Holmes's expression had grown sharp as a blade. "You believe Dr. Whitmore was blackmailing Lord Blackwood?" "I fear it is possible. Whitmore had been experiencing financial difficulties, gambling debts, I believe, though he never spoke of them directly. And if he recognized Lord Blackwood during that brief encounter, and if he somehow learned the nature of the consultation—" Aldridge's voice trailed off miserably. "Lestrade," Holmes said crisply, "I need you to locate Dr. Whitmore immediately. Send constables to his last known address. In the meantime, Dr. Aldridge, you must provide us with every detail you can recall about this man, his appearance, his habits, his associates." As Aldridge began his description, my mind raced ahead. If Dr. Whitmore was the blackmailer, had he also been the murderer? But how did that solve the impossible problem of the locked room? The pieces still did not fit together properly. Holmes, however, seemed to be following some thread invisible to the rest of us. "Dr. Aldridge, one final question. In your professional opinion, could symptoms of syphilis be artificially induced? Could someone make another person believe they were infected when they were not?" The physician's eyes widened. "In theory, yes. Certain chemicals could produce skin lesions and other symptoms that might be mistaken for venereal disease by a layman. It would be a cruel deception, but medically feasible. Thank you, doctor. You have been most helpful, despite the personal cost. Lestrade, see that Dr. Aldridge is escorted safely home and begin your search for Whitmore. Watson, come with me. I must examine Lord Blackwood's body more closely, and I believe we have overlooked something crucial in that study." We returned to the study, now empty except for the corpse, which remained as we had left it. Holmes went immediately to the body and began a meticulous examination, paying particular attention to Lord Blackwood's hands and face. He produced his lens and examined the skin with minute care. "Watson, look here. Do you see these small marks on his neck and jaw? A faint discoloration, barely visible." I leaned in to examine the areas he indicated. Indeed, there were subtle marks that I had not noticed during my initial observation. They could be natural variations in skin tone or perhaps minor blemishes. Or they could be the remnants of artificially induced lesions created to convince Lord Blackwood he was diseased. Consider it, Watson. Someone creates false symptoms on his body, knowing his guilty conscience will lead him to the worst conclusion. He consults a physician in secret, discovers he is not actually infected, but his paranoia persists. Meanwhile, the blackmailer demands payment to keep silent about the disease and the infidelity that supposedly caused it. The diabolical elegance of such a scheme was breathtaking. But Holmes, even if we accept this theory, and it does not explain how the murderer escaped from a locked room. Does it not? Holmes moved to the mirror once more, that ornate Venetian glass that had been turned to face the wall. He examined it with renewed intensity, running his fingers along the gilded frame and testing its weight. "Watson, help me take this down from the wall." Together, we lifted the heavy mirror from its mounting. As we lowered it carefully to the floor, I saw that the back was covered with a wooden panel, its surface scarred and aged. Holmes examined this panel minutely, then produced a thin blade from his pocket and began to probe its edges. "The frame is hollow in places," he murmured. "And this backing panel—" "Yes, I thought as much. It has been removed and replaced, though the work was done skillfully enough to escape casual notice. With careful manipulation, he managed to pry loose a section of the backing. Behind it, concealed within the hollow frame, was a space perhaps 3 inches deep and accessible along the mirror's entire lower edge. Within this hidden compartment lay several items: a small vial of clear liquid, a hypodermic syringe, and a folded piece of paper. Holmes extracted these items with the delicacy of an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasure. He opened the paper first, and I saw his eyes move rapidly across the text. Then he passed it to me. It was a letter, written in an educated hand. "Lord Blackwood, by the time you read this, you will have discovered that I have been inside your study despite the locked door, and this should demonstrate the futility of your attempts at security. You cannot hide from me. You cannot protect yourself. The documents I require must be delivered to the location I specified by tomorrow evening, or I shall ensure that every detail of your Cape Town indiscretion, including the nature of the disease you so fear, becomes public knowledge. Do not test my resolve. I have already proven I can reach you anywhere, even in your locked sanctuary. You know what I want. Deliver it, or face ruin. W for Whitmore," I breathed. "But Holmes, how did he place this letter inside the mirror frame? And how does this explain the murder?" Holmes smiled, that peculiar expression of satisfaction that indicated a puzzle solved. "Because, Watson, the mirror itself is the solution. Consider the sequence. Lord Blackwood receives threatening letters, grows increasingly paranoid. Someone, Whitmore, we may assume, gains access to this room at some point, perhaps during a social call or under some pretext. He conceals this threatening letter inside the mirror frame, along with the vial and syringe, evidence of his scheme to create false disease symptoms. Then he departs, leaving no obvious trace. But the locked door— The door was always locked from the inside, Watson. Lord Blackwood locked himself in, as his family believed, but Whitmore had already left his calling card where it would be found eventually. The letter was meant to be discovered only if Lord Blackwood examined the mirror closely, perhaps noticing something amiss with the frame. Thus it was psychological warfare, making Lord Blackwood believe his enemy could penetrate even his most secure refuge. Then who killed Lord Blackwood? Holmes turned to face me, and I saw something like pity in his expression. That is where my earlier reasoning went astray, Watson. I have been so focused on the impossibility of the locked room that I failed to see the simplest explanation. Lord Blackwood was not murdered at all. He took his own life. The word struck me like a physical blow. Suicide? But Holmes, the angle of the wound is consistent with self-infliction if one considers the precise position. A man seated at his desk, overcome with despair, could easily drive a letter opener into his own back by reaching around with his right hand and striking downward below his left shoulder blade. The force required would be considerable, but a man in the grip of desperate resolution could manage it. The position of the brandy glass to his left— he placed it there himself after pouring with his right hand, then reached across to drink. A nervous gesture while contemplating his final act.